My name's Howard Deiner. You probably know that already. And we'll be talking about an agility problem where we're talking about using agility in a scaled solution, in a larger setting, something not just one small team on a greenfield project, and how do we do this? So it's a more complicated problem. I'm going to speak specifically about the issues that I'll call platform versus product concerns, how we can distinguish them, how we understand them, and what we can do with them. And we'll see how that fits in with your situations. I do want to leave some time. I think this would be an excellent lecture to leave time at the end to try to speak to people and their situations. I think that there might be lots to share within the crowd, so I'm going to try to do that. But don't hesitate to stop me while we're going and say, Howard, that doesn't make any sense, or whatever. If it's something I can deal with, we'll talk about it then and there. If not, I'll defer it. But please try to keep it interactive as much as possible. All right, so to get going. Oh, that's inauspicious. Start again. Hi. Better. Focus problem. Anyhow, here's the lecture. But we'll start drilling down into stuff. I typically like to talk about the problems that we're looking at rather than the solutions at first, to give us some context and center us. And I'm going to start off with the comment that Agile isn't particularly new. Okay, I mean, I was amazed, when I started coming here, I think in 2011, at Software Architect Conference, and agility was something that was there, but it wasn't like big mainstream thing. And especially at the session yesterday, when I asked people, well, how many people are doing Scrum, which I'll ask again, how many people are doing Scrum in their organization? See, and back in 2011, I might have gotten like a quarter of that. Okay, and in a sense, Agile's become the new black. Right? I mean, if you're not doing Agile in your organization, people look at you like, well, why? Why wouldn't you want to do that? It's got such great things, and you get such beautiful outcomes. Why wouldn't you want to do it? But there are some problems with it. And I'll tell you the honest truth, and people that know me, know that I put these enigmatic, placeholders, photos, and stuff in here. I can't really figure out why I used that cover from Vanity Fair. I think there's an article in there about something being the new black, but when I look at it, I don't see it anymore. So it's a picture of Lady Gaga, whatever, new black. There's a nagging problem that goes on, okay, when we're talking about Agile and Scrum, and that problem has to do with scaling. And it's something that's been there since the beginning. That a lot of Agilists, in particular those that are really Scrum-oriented, just kind of like wave their hands and say, no, it's no problem at all, right? So you've probably heard, if you've been doing Scrum for a while, that to scale Scrum, it's simple. You just call a Scrum of Scrums, and like everything is better, and you ask 3 magic questions to your Scrum team, ask 3 magic questions in your Scrum of Scrums, and all your problems are better. Who uses Scrum of Scrums around here? Are they happy? They don't. Yeah, and that's the thing about it is I believe it was actually a question of Sutherland. They asked him way back when, okay, how do you scale? And he was like standing in a place like this, and he said, well, that's easy. You just make a Scrum of Scrums, and people kind of did that. But it doesn't work. I've been trying that for quite a while. I think that there's an issue. We're in a very small setting, which is organic, where the teams want to do it. If you have good people, they're going to figure it out on the team. And if you have 2 or 3 teams, they can figure it out between them. But there's a huge issue involved, and it has to do with kind of the tribal communication. I mean, how many people you have, Dunbar's number, right? I mean, past 150 people, you can't form groups, and you have smaller clans, at around 80, and then a smaller tribe that's around 15 or so, and you get these family units at 5 or 7, which explains why we have teams at that size, right? And it's a nasty problem. It's hard to get around it. how do we scale Agile in a larger setting? So I want to give you a little scope, okay, what we're going to talk about. I'm not particularly worried for this talk about how we take a particular project and just add more Scrum teams to it. I think that's a fairly well understood problem and fairly decent solutions for it. I used to work with Craig Larman, so those of you that are looking for scaling books, Craig has written a couple of them. And I believe in that kind of setting. It basically kind of looks like this. Right, I might as well start drawing some pictures here. Right, your typical sort of a Scrum environment, is a sprint planning, right, which goes on to daily planning, which we call the daily Scrum, right? And this stuff, iterates, right? And then it ends in a demo and a retrospective, and then the cycle kind of continues, right? Everybody's working from that big old backlog out here, and then they're coming up with another backlog for the sprint, with smaller stories in it, less of them. Right? Everybody's familiar with that one. Right? What Craig will say, what I'll say also, is that if you're trying to scale this so you need more teams, the stuff that works, again, small settings, respecting that communication stuff, is it's possible to have the teams working in parallel. This is where architecture and planning comes in handy. I wish I did some of that. And then before you go into that, you have to have some joint planning, right? So it'll start off in a scaled environment where we're having several Scrum teams that are trying to work on the same project. There's a common product backlog. Craig will call these, instead of sprint teams, he'll call them feature teams. But we're going to partition the work that's out here into something that makes sense for each of the sprint teams to work with, right? The sprint teams will actually then do detailed planning, right? And then they'll go through, at the end of the cycle. Wow, I really screwed up bad. Instead of a demo for each group, all of these will come together into a demo for the group of groups, right? They'll split up. Each team will do their retrospective. Okay, how do we get better as a team, okay, in our sprints to go? And then there'll be a retrospective for the team of teams. How do we work better as an organization? All right, are people familiar with that model at all? Yeah, that's common, and it works, okay? Again, up to limits, doesn't scale very far. But for a typical sort of project, we're not going to talk about that today. We have a single product and its features. You can get by with that. What I do want to talk about are organizations that have multiple products, multiple things. I'll tell you exactly more specifics of what I mean by that. Where there are some core competencies, okay, that are built in to each of these products that are distributed through the products themselves. Right, so we have some core stuff the company does. Let's just say it's data analytics, right? And then I have a bunch of products on top of that. Some of them are portals. Other things are, we'll distribute this information on portable devices, without using some kind of portal. Other things, work with some embedded devices. Okay, but they all work from that common competency of the company. The real value is in the data analytics in this case. Okay, so let me talk about what the differences will be when I say platforms versus products. Okay, and the first thing to recognize is what products look like. Products are in product lines. And I'm picking here on Apple. I guess this is the last generation of their hardware, right? They have a basic thing that they sell, right? The basic thing that they're selling allows them, is visible in various forms on different products that they have. right? So you take, a small product, it kind of fits in your hand. There's some specific things that it does better than others, right? I mean, those of you who use like, an iPhone, for me, I'll put my music on it, but I won't put it on an iPad, right? An iPad's meant to be held with two hands, right? And stuff that I'll do on there, I won't do things on that I'll do on my laptop, even though I could do them across all the lines. There's commonalities within them, especially when you look at the hardware. There are commonalities inside of it, but they're distinct product lines, distinct market segments that they sell them into. They're different customers in mind, right? We might not sell a consumer product to a business, right? Product lines. There are platforms inside of this. Now, in the Apple case, those platforms are pretty apparent, okay? And the one I'm going to pick on here is iCloud, right? There's an iCloud platform embedded in all that stuff. Okay, each one of the products will use this platform, right? And if you look at what Apple will say about it, they'll try to describe it. They'll try to give it some boundaries, some functionality, some scope, okay? It's more than storing your content. It lets you access all this junk from whatever device you're on. Those devices, of course, being their products, right? And it's built into every iOS device. Okay, to be fair, here's one from Microsoft talking about Windows 8. Okay, same kind of thing. It's focused on delivering one experience across all the devices in your life. These are the platforms, right, that are getting used in all the products that they produce. Now, not every platform is readily apparent. When I was thinking about this and reaching back, I was working with it's AT&T, right, a major US telecom. And they wanted some stuff on a whole bunch of mobile apps that they would stick onto their phones. Since they were controlling a large part of the stack, the physical stack, let's see, am I giving away too much on this? Yeah, I guess so. They had some unique stuff that they were embedding deep inside of TCP/IP that allowed them to, there's NDAs in here.
We'll let you suicide at the end of the talk.
Yeah, I'm going to get, please don't sue me, anybody. There are some unique features that they were embedding deep inside TCP/IP that allowed them to allow you to see content and know stuff about the content on different sorts of platforms, on different sort of products that were out there. And this stack was something that would be used on all the different sorts of projects, for all the different sorts of products that they had. So it was a huge problem. How do we work this in a traditional Scrum type setting? Right? In a Scrum setting, we want a team of people, all the people that are necessary to write the software. Right? We want generalized specialists and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, these guys that were doing the low-level TCP/IP stuff had no desire, clue, skills, in working, with a presentation layer for a particular Android platform, right? And there weren't enough of them to go around, right? We had a lot of teams out there developing these mobile apps. So how exactly do we do that? So it's a true pain in the process to try to transform an organization like that, okay? And you run into lots of issues when you start thinking about the why. Why do we do Scrum? Right? We do it because of, well, why do we do Scrum? I'll open the question to you. Why should I say it? Raise your paw. Don't be afraid. Why do we do Scrum?
Delivery.
Delivery? Yeah. Faster? Better? The change? React to change better? Right? I like that even more, although I agree with this too, right? The real reason, step away from all your development stuff. Think about the company is there to take concepts and convert them into cash. And the shorter that time is, the more successful the company will be, right? It has to do with, getting better products, not working so much on all the old stuff. It has to do with, looking at the market and its change and the variability that's out there and responding to it quickly, right? And when we start putting all kinds of process on top of something that allows us to figure this out, these platform issues out, okay, because they're scarce, and these guys don't want to be generalized specialists and all the rest of it, it hurts that ability to cycle. So the development of features that transcend any particular product delivery, the planning and coordination for that kind of stuff is well beyond what Scrum gives you as a set of guidelines, right? It's nice to start with Scrum. It's easy, right? Not that many rules. They're easy to follow. But it's only going to take you so far. And that's what we're going to be, talking about going forward. So I'm trying to define things here. Okay, product concerns. It's all the, is Tom in the room here? Okay, good, we can say this. It's all the functional and non-functional sorts of requirements all wrapped together, okay, that define what we need to give our product owner sufficient value to take the product that we have to market. Okay, so all the sorts of stuff about, that we got the right functionality, that it works, that it's got the right kind of qualities to it, all of that wrapped together. But it gets harder, right, the larger the organization comes to be. The product people are concerned, let's say, with features that are observable. But to implement those features, we need the product concerns working also. Right? So our platform concerns become an issue as we try to satisfy all of the functionality that the various products are out there. Okay. This gets us into why we have organizations the way that we do. We typically call them silos. They're specializations, right? And we form silos because of economies of scale. We say, look, we got a whole bunch of people, and they're really good at, let's pick a silo, doing databases, which is a bad example, or understanding TCP/IP and how to tweak it to make ourselves non-standard and give us a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Okay, and we form those silos that are out there. We're taught from an early age, I'll have a tale for you in a bit, that silos and planning go hand in hand, right? That was the basis of waterfall, right? Understand the problem really well, come up with a good solution to the problem, plan the work around it, okay? Then execute upon the plan, right? In working with silos, we do this, with more than one organization. We do this with a bunch of product teams, right? Product teams say what they need. That feeds into the requirements of the platform teams. Platform teams try to satisfy all that stuff in an optimal way. Everybody does a whole bunch of meetings and exchanging documents and shaking hands and nodding, and then they come up with a plan and they start executing upon it. It seems easy, right? Why does it fail? Why would something like that fail? It seems like a great thing to do. The unknowns. We don't know the unknowns, right? Especially when we talk about estimation. How hard is it going to be to do something? How long will it take us? Right, and these date back to the typical sorts of things with like foreseeability, the cone of uncertainty, familiarity. Yes? Yes? Just for those that aren't, right? If this is time, right? Our ability to estimate tails off quasi-exponentially, right? As time increases, our ability to understand what's going on outside at that time period gets hard. Okay, and it was first established back in the 60s when in the US they were doing their space program. And they would ask engineers, how long will it take you to do a certain thing? And if that certain thing was like a day, 2 days, a week, their estimates, plus or minus, they're pretty good. You'd ask the engineers, well, how long will it take you to do something if it's, for this other thing? And they said, well, I don't know, it's like a month or 2 months. Okay, their estimates were kind of like that. And they asked engineers, how long will it take you to do something with some complexity, like a lunar excursion module was one of the questions. And they said, how long will it take you to do that? And the estimates, these are from experienced, very experienced engineers, were somewhere on the order of off by up to a factor of 4 times, okay, which isn't bad. Isn't bad for long range. I mean, this is something, the problem is that if they said something like, well, it'll take us 6 months, the good side of that is it could be as short as a month and a half. That'd be great. Or it could be 2 years. We have the same issues in the planning that we do today, which is why back in the 60s, the space program was actually an agile project, although people don't recognize it as such. Anyhow, we're way off topic. Let's get back to what we're doing. For me, the idea of silos for specialization of work doesn't make sense. As an organization, we should be trying to cross-train one another. We should be trying to share information. It just doesn't make sense. What does make sense is that we need centralized decision-making on certain critical sorts of things. And those business critical, those core competencies of our business are best made in small teams. Now, it was interesting. I forget who said it. It came up yesterday. I was talking about code ownership, strong ownership, weak ownership, and collective ownership. Does anybody remember that? Okay. And the question came up about architecture, I believe, and whether there should be strong ownership or weak ownership. And I probably drooled a little bit and looked at my toes. But I thought about it last night, and that was like extremely penetrating. It was a really good thought. And in fact, I'm coming back and saying, yeah, if when it comes to the core sorts of platform issues that we deal with, we need to make decisions by our best and brightest people in these platform teams. Okay, and we have to keep that kind of small. Okay, which sounds horrible, but it's not. Right? I mean, in a business, the ideas are best generated in small groups and tested in larger ones. Okay, and when we find out that the people that are making these decisions are making poor ones, well, we might want to move on. But large committees on architecture don't make good decisions. Large committees on any kind of decisions don't work out well. Right? I mean, that was one of the reasons way back when. When was this? Back in, I guess, around 1990 or so, there was a joint development agreement between Microsoft and IBM. And they were trying to produce something that would marry Windows and OS/2. Anybody remember those heady days back then? And that joint development agreement fell apart. It fell apart because of this kind of reason. It fell apart because the way that Microsoft worked was that they would send 10 people to work on the JDA. IBM, on the other hand, was sending in like 500 people. And in the Microsoft world, the guy that kind of knew the answer to this, to a particular issue, wanted to make a decision, said, here's where we should go. Other people might disagree with him, from Microsoft, but they respected it. From IBM, they would form committees, and they would meet, and they would look not just for consensus, but they'd look for unanimous votes on things. And there were politics going on, and things dragged on and on and on. And Microsoft finally said, we've had enough of this. We don't care what happens. Sue us on the JDA. We don't care. We're launching Windows 3. And they did. And regardless of where they are today, that was a brilliant move on their part. Anyhow, centralized decision-making makes sense to me. And that's why we kind of need some sort of silos for platforms. Okay? We're really looking about someone who's accountable for architecting a piece of the puzzle, a very important piece of the puzzle. Okay? And we also have to find a way to coordinate that work so that the teams that have those requirements, if you will, can get satisfied in a time-effective way. So silos, can they be forces of good? Maybe. I don't know. Let's look at other aspects of this issue. okay? The first one I want to look at is the difference between research and development, right? Many organizations, instead of having like an IT staff, will call those people R&D, right? We say that, but we forget kind of what goes on in there. You know, research gives us ideas that enable new products. Research doesn't produce products. Development actually makes those new products, right? Research, the lead times on a research project are kind of chaotic. They're kind of unpredictable. It's really hard to say, right? It's very difficult to go into a team of people and say, listen, guys, by next Tuesday, I need you to have 3 earth-shattering innovations for me. Okay, got it? You know, have a good lunch, right? We do that all the time, okay, in a sense, with our development teams, right? We say, by next Tuesday, we need you to be somewhere in this area. Does that look feasible? How far can you get? We kind of hold them accountable for it, right? So there's a big difference in research and development. We'll also look at it from a different sense. Those of you that were here yesterday remember this one as Stacy Matrix from Ralph. In complexity theory, development teams tend to, you know, they're in the complex space. The software we're talking about, there's issues related to people, there's issues related to unforeseeability between systems. There's somewhere, the development is somewhere in the complex space, but it's usually down towards complicated, right? On the research end of things, the problems that we're solving, you know, there's far from certainty as to exactly how we're going to approach even these problems. So the research teams tend to be in complex, but out towards the chaotic space, right? And in a sense, there's a difference with what happens from an economic standpoint also. Since this stuff is getting towards just the complicated, right, on terms of our development end of things, we're producing products that we sell, okay, and in accounting terms, we call that an extrinsic benefit. Right? We can ring the cash register, put it on the P&L, boom, we got something that we made money with. On the other hand, when research teams put stuff together, it tends to be you know, towards that chaotic region, and it's an intrinsic benefit, right? Meaning things like, oh, we could patent it, okay, and somebody could increase our valuation because we have the potential to make products with this, right? And whether or not you patent it is irrelevant, but it's an intrinsic benefit to the organization from research versus extrinsic benefit from development, right? So something to distinguish on. So let's make a bold statement here. And that bold statement is, from a business perspective, software companies couldn't care less what process you use to produce the software. Doesn't really matter, okay? What does matter is that they can produce the stuff in a way that they can sell it and have some idea of how to plan for it, right? And in a real sense, it's not even the planning for it. They want some sort of predictability, if you will, some way of knowing that we can shorten that cycle, you know, from the concept that they have or the need that's recognized in the marketplace to the actual thing that they're selling, right? Taking short-term gains, but in the process sacrificing our long-term sustainability is a losing proposition. And I want you to think back at that when I talk about the various scaling methods, right? Because we might come up with some methods that allow us to scale really well on what we have, but we're going to forget about the future, which is why I have that R&D kind of concept going on here. All right, so that's enough about the problem. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of solutions. Well, not a whole bunch, a half a dozen. Now, when I go through them, okay, and I've kind of used like all 6 of them, that's why they're there, I need to somehow establish a grade. And this is not a grade where I can take a tape measure and see exactly how well they did. You know, a lot of this grade is a little bit subjective, okay? But I need to have some kind of ideas of what we're going to grade on. So the first thing that I need to, to get to that grade is to think about a different diagram. It's very related, as you can tell from the way that it's laid out. Okay, it's called a Sinafin diagram, okay, which talks about the different ways of what we need to approach problems, right, in our simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic spaces, right? Now, in very simple problems, such as, how do I use this pencil and write out a message, right? We can rely on well-known best practices. Best practice is pick up the pencil in your preferred hand, apply it to paper, and start moving it. It's going to work. Okay, in a more complicated area, there's going to be there's going to be some more uncertainties involved, but it's well understood enough that there's a bunch of good practices to use. So there might be some checklists that we can give people and say, okay, the way to approach this kind of stuff is take a look at your corporate CSS guides to construct web pages. Take a look at some examples that you'll find on the web in these kind of places, okay, about how to put together the HTML for them. And go through and say, well, these are the ways that you kind of approach it, okay? So they're not best practices, but we can give you some stuff that will help you with it. Once we get to a complex, there's no best practices to have for complex, right? It's too dynamic. We don't know enough about it. We don't even know enough about it to give you checklists, which is why if you ask me just simple questions about, well, I'm an Agile shop and I'm starting off, and what kind of stuff should I do, to make my Scrums more effective? I'm not going to sit down and say, do this, do this, do this, do the next thing. It may work, it may not, right? It's too complex. What you need to solve problems in the complex space are things like values and principles, which is why the Agile Manifesto, for example, starts off with some 4 values and 12 principles. All right, we can apply that to it. Chaotic space stuff, where we don't really know enough about the problem to even put together solutions. But where we can come up with solutions, they're like wonderful, even though they may or may not work forever. Those sorts of things, there's going to be some novel practices. Okay, from a product standpoint, if we can get to some ways of approaching problems that really can't be solved, yet give us some solutions. Okay, they may or may not work, right? But they're going to be high value. So I have very little to say about chaotic, other than go back and apply scientific method, right? And again, that's why in an Agile space, we do that inspect and adapt kind of cycle. We took off the diagram there. We do our work throughout the iteration. We look at what went on. At the end, we stop. We deliver something. Then we reflect back and say, well, how could we have done that better? All right, so that's a deference to the chaotic nature of where we're at. All right, so now Agile has just officially left the room. Okay, we're actually not going to talk about Agile or Scrum for a while. Instead, I want to reach back and talk about lean and lean principles. Okay, and lean goes way back. Taiichi Ohno first described those 7 lean wastes with the Toyota production system. All right, we're going to talk about them now. In 2003, Mary and Tom Popendick took the Toyota production system and kind of reinterpreted what was going on inside of that, made it applicable to software. And if you haven't read this book, you'll want to. It's called Lean Software Development and Agile Toolkit. As I said yesterday, there's a nice little acronym called Tim Wood, where we can remember what those 7 deadly wastes are. So maybe we'll talk about them. First of those is transportation. Okay, and a transportation waste, and recall this, lean came out of the manufacturing world, right? So most of the classical definitions have to do with how we manufacture stuff, right? And in a manufacturing world, when a product's moved, such as it's moving from one station to the next, it's on a conveyor belt, it has to get moved from one plant to another, there's a risk that the product is going to get lost or delayed or whatever. That cost involved in it adds no value to the product. Right? So in our quest to get lean, it's like, well, how can we get those costs out so that we're delivering nothing but value? In software, we do this when we produce documents or other sorts of artifacts and start handing them off. And think back to like scaling inside of teams, right? Where else would those kind of handoffs occur, might you think? Right? We take it to a certain point and then we have to move on. Does that remind anybody? I don't know, maybe let's take a look at our calendars. And might also occur, those handoffs typically also occur when we have meetings where decisions get made, right, that coordinate, kind of synchronize the teams again, right? So there's transportation wastes that are out there all over the place, okay? Now, another huge waste that we have is inventory, right? In a manufacturing sense, inventory waste occurs when you're not using the just-in-time principles, right? So I have big piles of parts that need to be assembled, right? And when I assemble them, maybe they're made out of steel, and maybe it's not a great environment, and they can rust on me before I can put them together into something, or they corrode in other ways, or they go stale, right? In any case, even if none of that occurs, there's a huge amount of money that's spent in just buying those raw materials, right? And what happens, of course, when the raw materials, well, there was something that, or the components, there was an upgrade to them, and there's now a new version of it, right? We have the same kind of issues in software. Do we work with the old stuff, which may have defects in it? Do we throw them away, work with the new ones? Right, it's a similar sort of thing, right? We, though, are so used to seeing inventory around and working in a manufacturing world that we many times don't even recognize that there's inventory waste that's going on. Who in here can describe the branching that they use in their software control systems? How do you branch for
Again, sprint will branch off the sprint branch.
You have a sprint branch,
Yeah.
and each team has a sprint branch.
No, so currently we all work, we have separate repos that each sprint team will then merge up to the main repo, but everyone works on the default branch within those repos they go.
Okay, so everybody's in one.
Yes.
Does anybody in here have, and I've seen that, that's good. Anybody in here, when they have separate teams, have different branches for each team? Yeah, yeah. And how does that, now my point is going to be that our merges are a result of an inventory waste. All the stuff that we're sticking out here in our little branches are kind of like raw materials that are waiting to get assembled together. Right? We never think about this stuff, but it's hidden out there anyhow. Inventory waste, another thing to concern yourself about. Motion. Okay, now we talked about transportation waste. And we talked about how there was a damage to the actual thing that we were moving around. In motion waste, on the other hand, there's a damage to the thing that's creating the product. So if you will, as we have a conveyor belt, we're moving stuff around it. All the time we're using that thing, we're using up the conveyor belt too. Right? Now, that's a little bit tougher to look at, right? Because we don't, it's not that our computers are necessarily wearing out just because we're putting together software on them, although one could talk about that. But actually, where this kind of stuff occurs is not on the hardware side of it, it's on the peopleware side of it, task switching side of it, right? Every time we go and put something away to work on something else, there's a motion waste that occurs in task switching. So, Gerald Weinberg, and I'll have to give you the cite for this, I just thought of it now, but in one of his quality books in the early part of the 90s, and so definitely contact me after this and I'll get you the cite, talked about the effectiveness of people on different projects that they were working on at once. So if they had a task switch between, two or more projects. And by the way, who in here task switches between 2 or more projects at once? Oh, the truth comes out. Okay, pay attention. So if we are working on one and only one project at a time, there's a certain amount of time that we can spend our attention to. We'd like to say it's 100%, but it's really not, right? There's got to be some time out there to answer the telephone, you know, see that there's new email, take a drink of water, go to the bathroom, whatever it is. So if we're working on one project, our effectiveness, let's say that it's somewhere around 80%. Now, I can thank my friends at the Harvard Business School who came up with the idea of matrixing organizations back in like the 70s. But the theory was like, well, if I have one person and they're doing a job but they're not using all their cycles, well, let's figure out another job for them to do to get the rest of the cycles, really get the efficiency of that person up as high as we possibly could. Jerry Weinberg looks at the problem and says, well, if I have you working on two projects at once, one would think that your efficiency would be half of what you would normally have for one project, in this case around 40%. Well, it's not, right? And I'm not going to give you the exact number because I don't recall, but it was somewhere around like 20%, something like that. Where'd the rest of the time go? Context switching, right? Our brains are not good at doing context switching. Even computers, you know, that simulate real-time, you know, motion between multiple things happening at once, they're set up with like special circuitry to save state and restore state rapidly. Our brains haven't evolved to that point yet. So, you know, it's a horrible thing. I normally, when I get off on a tangent like this, start citing statistics about, you know, texting while driving and how deadly that is, and you know, it's worse than being drunk. And, but it's a terrible problem, right? So when we're programming, okay, it's the worst of all possible worlds, right? It might take us an hour to get set in the debugger and have that break, you know, on the particular line that we're looking for. We're about to hit continue, and then, you know, somebody walks in the room and says, hey, you got 5 minutes? When they really mean you got the rest of the afternoon to talk to me. Right? We have to like say, oh, just a second. You put the thing that you're working on away and you save everything. You come back to it, well, it's going to take you another hour to get back into the place where you were. Right? So it's a horrible thing. When you're starting to work with 3 projects at once, that goes down to some ridiculous level. He, I'm not even going to bore you. He said that by 5 projects, the amount of work that you would get done on any of the projects is negligible. And that the, you know, the certainty that you're going to get something done on a particular time is kind of random, right? So motion waste is a serious, serious problem. We've got to move along here. Waiting. Waiting occurs in manufacturing when something needs to be processed and has to wait for the stuff before it, right? We see this all the time in software development, right? In a software development, you know, if a tester needs to give feedback to a developer, or a developer has to wait for a UX person to put something together, or the tester is waiting on the developer to finish so they can do their test, all of that time is going to contribute to a waste in our development time. All right? Over processing. In a manufacturing world, a lot of engineering goes into making sure that you don't specify the components that you need. Right? There's no use in putting in a solid state component that's, you know, good for 20 years when the device is going to fail after 18 months anyhow, right, and get tossed. It's a consumer device. So we, you know, in a software world, we sometimes find that hard to understand. But if you were to go and put together an artifact, let's say we needed an artifact that said, here's what our domain model kind of looks like. Okay, so we all have to talk about this. And, you know, we might get away with just drawing something on the board, right? And that's, you know, here's our domain model. As ugly as it is, it took us 10 minutes to draw up there, and it conveys information. A lot of people say, no, 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 it's not good enough. I have to go back and make a nice UML2 diagram out of this. You know, and I almost got there with Visio yesterday, but, you know, another day or two, and I'm sure it can be done. You know, it's over-processed. There's no reason to have that kind of stuff going on. We need to spend our time and our cycles on the code rather than those artifacts that are incidental to code production. Overproduction. Wow. Why would overproduction be a waste? Well, in a manufacturing world, overproduction occurs with things like batching. Sometimes it's unavoidable in a manufacturing world, right? I was working on a thing back in the 80s that had to do with a particular airplane which is very recognizable, and it's something called, now we call it the B-2, right? It was made out of composites, right? And so they'd have all these pieces that they needed to lay up and cure, right? And they had to figure out how these pieces would fit together optimally, on some laminates, right? And these laminates came in a certain size, so they would batch them up together, right? Well, the batching that then occurs, okay, to fill up this entire sheet leads to all kinds of other wastes, right? So the guy that's waiting for this piece over here has to wait until there's a need to put in a piece over there to fill out the whole batch, right? We do this with software all the time, right? We call them releases. We call them iterations, right? They're batches, okay? And they lead to lots of waste in inventory. I'd rather have a little bit of waste from an iteration, right, than a big waste from a release batch. But they're batches, right? Ultimately, we'd like to get away from that kind of stuff. Finally, there's a waste that occurs in defects, right? And defect waste is a horrible thing, right? It led to quality control people who would look at the assembly line and push off the pieces that didn't look right to go back for further manufacturing to fix them, right? Unnecessary. The idea from the Toyota production system was to get to 0 defects, right? Because ultimately, the quality of your product is the thing that the customers are going to judge you on, right? We have the same kind of problems in software, and I'm not going to bore you to tears about this kind of stuff, okay? But in software, the way that we get to better quality is to stop testing at the end and start testing it before we build it, right? Test-driven development, test-first development. I'm going to be here tomorrow. I'll be talking about behavior-driven development and actually do it with you, okay, with that defect waste. So here, we need a tail. Here's the tail I was going to talk about. It's about batch sizing, right? And the problem with batches is that for anybody that's been born since the Industrial Revolution, we start thinking immediately, almost from birth, that the best way to go about doing stuff is the efficient way to do it. And the efficient way to do it is to form an assembly line, right? And if you go back to the James Womack book, Lean Thinking, back in 1996, he talks about a time when he was working at MIT, doing lean stuff. And he was also a consultant. And he used to send out news flyers. So he had like this big stack of news flyers, about 100 of them. And he wanted to have his daughters, who were 5 and 9 at the time, help him put those news flyers into the envelopes. So he said, girls, could you help me with it? And they said, sure. And the first thing they wanted to do was to say, well, you do the folding. Right, the process was you had to take the flyers, you had to fold them, you had to put them into the envelopes, you had to address them, you had to put stamps on them, and then deliver them, right? The girls said, well, what we'll do is I'll stand here and I'll fold all of them, and but when I'm done with that, you can take them and put them into the envelopes, and then when you're done with that, I'll take them and put the addresses on them, thinking that if they were forming those silos, okay, those stations on the assembly line, that they would get really good at doing it. I mean, once I get to fold it, I'll get to fold really efficiently, right? Thinking, oh, this will be the efficient way of doing it. Again, it's industrial age thinking. Of course, James told them, well, no, really what you should do is take one flyer, fold it, put it into the envelope, then write the address in it, then put the stamp on it, and then it's done. And they said, no, 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 Daddy, that's inefficient. So he said, fine, here's half the stack. You girls do your half, I'll do mine. All right? Who won? Well, I wouldn't be telling you this if the girls won, right? You know, I mean, James was exploring all kinds of stuff about lean back then, and he was pretty confident and won. But it's hard to see, like, well, why? Why would that work? And the problem is that there was all this hidden work sitting out there, right? All of the work of taking each flyer, not just folding it, but now putting it into a stack. And now, like, keeping the stack nice and crisp, then moving it down to the next station. All of that's work involved. There adds no value in doing it, other than the fact that it's, you know, how we got it done. So, hidden work in that when the flyers, if you ever folded a piece of paper and put it into an envelope and found out that didn't fit, okay, well, you go back and refold it. If you folded 100 of them and have to go back and refold 100 of them, that's a lot of extra work. The idea from this is that we got to get to smaller batches, right? Our efficiency as an organization depends on the fact that we get rid of the waste that's involved in the overall process. So rather than talk about, let's make each station efficient, let me be an efficient envelope folder, news flyer folder, right? That's not what we're out to do. We're not out to get an efficient UX designer. What we need are products. And the way to get there is to start single streaming, okay, which is what James would call the single streaming and swarming around the stuff that we're trying to do, right? And I hope that you recognize that's kind of like the basis of where Scrum is orienting you, right? Scrum says get all the people you need to make the software, put them together, and work on one thing until it's done, right? At its essence, that's what Scrum is meant to do. It gets damning when we have people that are saying, well, I'm doing multiple projects at once. And I'll ask a follow-on question. Do the people on the teams serve on multiple teams at once?
Generally not.
Generally not. That's good. That's good, because when they have to matrix their time between many teams, well, as you can imagine, their efficiency goes very quickly to zero. All right. Does this make sense? Make sense? Okay. Good. All right. So that's how we're going to grade solutions. Now, let's go through the various states that I have out there and take a look at them. Okay? Now, I've characterized them from bad to good. You know, don't take it personally. If any of these, by the way, show up, you know, like, oh, this is how we work, it's not personal. This is just, you know, my recollection and my observations of how this goes. Anyhow, a lot of organizations, when they start looking at the problems inherent in, you know, what we're talking about, say, they just throw up their hands and they say, absolutely no way to do that. We're too big. We're too complex. We can't use Agile and Scrum, right? And hey, by the way, we've used waterfall really successfully before. So let's go back to Das V model or the V model or Prince 2. Anybody in here use Prince 2? Okay, good. There's a lot of people I know from like Australia. I guess it started around, anyhow, Prince 2, rational unified process. They got great templates. They got this great product. We'll go use them, you know. And oh, by the way, let's go get a software assembly line put together. And we'll just pound out this stuff after we figure out what our process is. Well, as you can imagine, I might not think too highly of something like that, right? Developing any non-trivial software in a predictive process will fail, right? And furthermore, we usually define failure by being on time, on feature, and on budget. And we forget that software can also fail in another really meaningful way, which is that even if it's on time, on feature, and on budget, like that contract that we're going to get, you know, that says we completed the waterfall correctly, if it doesn't do what we needed to do as a business, it would either miss the market, you know, develop the wrong product for the wrong market, whatever, you know, all that we've done is had a highly successful project that fails. Right, we planned a good failure. So grades, of course, aren't all that great. there's a lot of handoffs, so our transportation waste is high. The inventory waste that we get, putting in all of the stuff into requirements. If we go back and ask people, give us your requirements, we ask them so infrequently that they'll tell us everything in the kitchen sink, right? And so we'll put them all in there, and a lot of inventory waste going on. When we start batching up all those things, and then we start switching back and forth between the various places to make things happen, motion waste, waiting. We're waiting to get started. We're waiting to get everything together. There's a huge risk in any sort of a non-iterative process that we're going to get to the end, integrate stuff together, and it ain't going to work, right? Which causes a lot of defect waste as we go back and fix that stack. Fails with waiting, they're over-processing. Since on the delivery side, we don't get a chance to get into that code very often. Well, hey, while we're in here, let's add all the things that we think we're ever going to need, right? And of course, when we try to predict the future, especially as developers, we're never going to get it right, right? But all that code still has to compile. All that code still has to have no negative effects on all the rest of the code. So there's a waste from over-processing. We overproduce, right? Most famous of those is like from the Standish reports, right? This, follows the Pareto principle pretty tightly. Okay, about 20% of the features that we do are actually the ones that people use all the time. The other 80% are not. Okay, and then the statistic that most people cite is, used all the time and used frequently forms around 1/3 of the features that we do. Well, the 2/3 of the stuff is overproduction, right? Overproduction waste. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in here is involved in commercial software development, software we sell to others. Okay, in a commercial world, it's kind of okay to do that, and sometimes you have to, right? Because a lot of people, when they buy software, have checklists. Do you have this feature? Yep. You got this one? Yep. You got this one? Yep. Not that anybody's going to use them, but we figure as long as you're going to buy it, might as well buy the one that has all the features. But in an internal development world, okay, that overproduction waste is like, you got 2/3 of your cycles available to do stuff that you need. Like, wow, that's a horrible thing. Defect stuff, I'm not going to go into that. The testing that occurs at the end, though, is a highly wasteful thing, a lot like the integration at the end. Testing and integration go hand in hand, of course. Batching, it's hard to get worse, right? I mean, we plan for one iteration, right? So our batch is the entire thing, all right? So naturally, it's bad. Think of James and his 2 daughters. All right, waterfall doesn't work, but you knew that already. So a lot of organizations will say, okay, I get it. We're going to form Scrum where we can, right? In particular, let's form Scrum for these products that are out there. Those are usually our projects, right? So we'll form Scrum teams around them. But we don't want to do it with the rest of the organization. I know you guys, and they're talking Agile, want to go in and start talking about test-first development, acceptance-driven development, all these fancy things. But our teams that are doing the core stuff, what I'm going to call platform concerns, they know what to do. So we're not going to bother them. Problem is that those Scrum teams always have to be ready to ship, right? And if we're depending, this is hard to do, if we're depending on stuff coming out from the platform teams that are using planned, predictive, waterfall-type work, well, then we can't be ready to ship until we get their stuff wired in, right? So we haven't accomplished a whole lot. Our release planning, it doesn't get any better, right? We still need to plan all the dependencies on our components, on our platform components, so that we can start planning our own products, on the Scrum side of things, right? And we got to get past the point where the platform people need to understand everything up front, right? So we really can't get past that. So if you go back and grade it, okay, transportation-wise, we still have lots of documents that are out there. We still have to do a lot of statusing between the documents. We have to understand changes of requirements. We have to have the appropriate meetings and stuff in place. Still a mess. We haven't made any changes in inventory, any meaningful changes, right? We've gotten a little bit lighter, quite honestly, on the product side. We might not require things that are so evident, but you probably know those things anyhow, and they're pretty easily taken care of with just a backlog for a Scrum team or for a product team. Motion waste actually gets a little bit better, right? And it's better because the planning that goes on inside of the product teams is no longer predictive, right? The product owner is making more decisions just in time at the last responsible moment when they have the best information and can make the best decisions, right? A very lean kind of phrase, which I'll give to Mary Poppendick, right? So motion waste gets better. Waiting doesn't get better, right? We're still waiting on our platform teams to complete. The product teams are still over-processing stuff, right? We still haven't gotten past the idea of the platform people are going to be asked for features only infrequently, so let's ask them to do it. This will lead to more overproduction kind of stuff. Oh, I'm sorry, overproduction will actually get better, right, on the product side. Overproduction actually gets better, right, because the things like you ain't going to need it start sticking, all right. Defects are going to get better because things like non-production sorts of defects are now handled in a lightweight fashion, okay. But we still haven't really moved the needle on batching. We're still waiting on our platform teams to batch up the stuff for us so that we can get done. In other words, our WIP, our work in process, is still real high until the final release comes together. All right. This has huge effects. There's some teams I'm working with right now that are trying to get, still using this kind of stuff. And you see these really insidious sorts of things that happen where, well, I'll ask you guys, when you guys do your release planning as a Scrum team, right, how many iterations do you wait, before the end where we kind of like want to harden the code and do our final testing and all that kind of stuff? How many iterations? Have you had like 6 iterations in a release?
I don't understand the question.
Oh, okay, so here's the question. I'm sorry.
I don't think you're talking about... Are you describing doing some different things at the end of a set of iterations that actually are part of what you normally do?
Yes, and one reason that it's probably so quizzical is like, what could you possibly be talking about? I understand Scrum. Why are you saying so? If there's a...
I have to say, I don't do Scrum. I don't like the language of Scrum.
Ah, perfect.
Sorry.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, if this is a release, right, from here to here, is a release boundary. All right.
Yeah.
Traditionally, when we did waterfall, right, we broke up the release and we said, okay, up in the front, we're going to do some analysis, whatever you want to call it. We're going to do some design, then we're going to do some coding, and we're going to do some testing. Right? Well, when we apply this in a Scrum world where we have teams in the back that are still working with this, the effect is that it overlays well, those weren't equal, but they're supposed to be equal. It overlays our traditional sorts of 6 iterations within a release. And we, in a Scrum world, typically, where there's some complicated stuff, we kind of in our minds are thinking, oh, that last iteration, we don't want to take on too many new features. We want to make sure that everything's kind of, it's an unspoken truth, right? But when you start looking at most waterfall teams, especially teams that have had trouble, they're reserving like 2, sometimes 3 iterations inside the release. Well, that has the effect on the, when it goes back to the product teams that are doing Scrum of, well, we can't take on any new work, for these last 3 iterations, and that's a horrible thing, right? So our batching gets huge again, and we haven't made any progress with it. So we can't do it with core component teams, especially core component teams that continue to work in a waterfallish way, right? So instead, some people will use this concept of guest stars. I wonder if that's something that people around here do. When I describe it, maybe you call it something else, okay? The idea about this is like, well, we don't have enough people in our component teams to put them with all the Agile teams, right? Maybe we have 8 people that form our core component team, and we've got these other 6 Agile teams to work with that are consuming that core competency, right? So if I needed to put all of them out there, it would be like I'd have to hire more people. You know, they wouldn't be effective if I just took one person and stuck them in each team, right? Who's going to do the research end of things, right, for the new stuff on the platform side? So it's a huge problem. And instead, what we do is we say, well, the component teams, the platform people will stay where they are. But we recognize the fact that they have to work more closely with the Scrum teams. So what we'll do is we'll tell them, you guys are guest stars, you're rock stars, whatever we say, and we tell them, come in and join this team, you know, attend their planning sessions, you know, work with them daily, you know, try to do what you can, matrix your time, whatever, we don't say that, but we kind of are saying that, right? And they're trying to work, you know, in a mode that is neither fish nor fowl, okay? So what goes wrong with it is that the guest stars really don't have that commitment, the commitment that they need to the team. They have no way of managing their time properly, right? There's another problem that goes on with it is that the people that are trying to work together can't effectively work as a team anymore, right? If there's component people, platform people that are used to working with stuff, they no longer have that communication that they used to have, right? And again, what I normally see with this is that the platform people, maybe it's the titles that we give them, we call them guest stars, whatever, typically will show up, you know, to things like our planning sessions, sit there, in their minds they're trying to get requirements, trying to bring them back, right, as a communication mode, and they're kind of like waving to the rest of the team and saying, hi, we're here. They never show up, you know, to embed with the team, right, and they're ineffective, right? So when we go back and look at things, you know, I'll say that guest stars help with transportation waste, especially if they're showing up at our planning sessions. We no longer have to have documents we throw over the wall from a product team to a platform team, right? So that's a little bit better. In terms of inventory, nothing has changed. There's still a bunch of stuff that eventually the platform team documents and works on. Motion has gotten a little bit better, right? There's a stream of product flowing rather than these bumpy things that we would see otherwise in a large batched environment, right? Weighting hasn't really changed just because we're using guest stars. You know, while there are communications mechanism to the product teams, they're usually coming back and saying, well, that stuff that you were waiting on, it isn't going to happen. Okay, so that's not really all that helpful. You know, in terms of over-processing, that's not any different than what we were talking about before. The overproduction stuff is still very much the same. Defects actually get a little bit better, right? Because we can at least understand through someone with direct communication what our problems are on the platform side of the house. Okay, those components that we're not used to working with. So, you know, defect remediation probably gets a little bit better. Batching, it actually hasn't changed, right? I mean, the only thing that we've really done with guest stars is to help communication a tad. All right, well, there's some other ways to do this. One way is to say, fine, all feed in. The whole organization now goes Scrum. Now, this is going to have some implications, right? It's going to have some implications because we have to split up our platform team and put them onto the various Scrum teams, right? First of those implications, of course, was that we no longer have anybody that's kind of like doing the architecture for the most valuable stuff that the organization does, right? So, there's going to be huge problems, in terms of, remember that distinction between research and development? Basically, by splitting up your platform team, you've thrown away the research. And you said, we're going to work with what we have right now architecturally for the core platforms that we support, and we're going to concentrate on development. And that's kind of an issue, because you're looking at, how can I optimize for those short-term gains? We're no longer looking forward, on our platforms. Another issue has to do with what's called Conway's Law. Anybody heard of this one before? Oh, excellent, excellent. Right. So, effectively, your architecture is related to the organizational structure that you have. Which is why if you have who wrote that thing? Copling. If you have 4 groups working on a compiler, you get a 4-pass compiler, right? Our architecture, when we split up our platform team and put them on all the Scrum teams, is similarly going to be, just segregated out into various little pieces along the way, right? Root cause about this stuff is people, right, and how to get them to communicate. Again, silos can actually be forces of good, done correctly. Grades, okay, I wish that the handoffs were gone, okay, but the problem is that we've traded one sort of a handoff for another. Since there really are these platform issues that are used across the various products, we still are going to have to figure out how to move them around from one team to the next. We usually do that with meetings now, right? Our inventory stuff has gone away, right? I mean, we are now working on just the stuff that we have to deliver. And that's good, okay? We've given it away so much, though, that we're not working on anything in the future, but I'll pass on that for right now. Motion-wise, again, we've now decided that we're going to form a Scrum team and work on one thing and get it done, right? We're going to get rid of those evil matrixing effects, right, and focus and get something out. And that's a great thing, right? I'd like to say that we nailed it on weighting, but we really haven't, right? We still have to make sure that there's some kind of coordination between the multiple Scrum teams that are out there. They still will end up kind of working with one another on a particular aspect, within the architecture. The over-processing stuff kind of goes away, right? Because Scrum teams are usually pretty good at those lightweight artifacts and doing just what they need. I wish I could say that overproduction goes away. It actually doesn't, right? Because we're not being forward-thinking too much. We're actually underproducing, right? And we're actually producing some technical debt as we go because of that, right? Because we're not really planning for the correct sort of an architecture. We're just doing one. Defects, it's a similar thing. It's not really going away. I really want to move us, make sure that we have enough time at the end here. Another way of doing this, I'm going to do this very quickly, is let's recognize the core component as a different company. Okay, in the case of that one that I did for AT&T, they actually sold that component in and of itself, like a software development kit. Oops. In any case, the primary stuff is from this organization that handles our platforms. So why don't we just make them a company? Even if we don't make them a real company, treat them like they're a vendor, okay? And then they'll have a backlog, right? The market forces will figure out what to do. And if they start thinking like a company, we'd expect that we'd get good stuff from them. Okay, unhappily, there's some issues that come up with that. And the basic thing that I want to talk about, and I'll even forget what's on here, is that when we start thinking in terms of what this company would be if they were an entity by themselves, they tend to start thinking in terms of what their product backlog would be and how to best manage that, right? Which isn't the concerns of each of the platform teams, product teams. The product teams are worried about the stuff that actually gets sold, but these platform guys are now thinking, oh, well, if I were a company, this is how I would organize it. And that's going to lead to large batches, which we will see as we go through this, right? Our transportation stuff comes back, right? Because we now have to figure out the concerns of everybody internally. And we usually do that with the traditional sort of give us your requirements, and we'll figure out how to work on them, right? Inventory stuff, you know, again, it's a bad thing. You know, the platform teams are now going to start thinking about, you know, an optimal solution to satisfy all the needs at once, rather than thinking in terms of the single streaming that we need for the best business value for the company. Again, it's not the optimization of one piece, it's the optimization of the whole organization that we really want. Motion doesn't go away, we got large things. In fact, motion and waiting get worse, right? Because now we might start seeing a requirement come up in one release for a product that gets taken into the next planning cycle for the platform team, and a result doesn't come out until a third release from where we are, right? So it can get horrible. It can get worse than, you know, we started off with. Let me get past this. Okay, these are, you know, it seems like a great idea. Believe me, it's like one of the worst ideas, but it's different thinking. I want to give you something that actually works, okay, and then spend a little bit of time on this. And that is that I believe that the right way that you organize this kind of stuff, and it's worked for me in a couple of instances at least, is to have product teams that are Scrum, or whatever iterative method you want to use for it. All right? Have platform teams that get split in two, if you will. Okay? You know, on the research side, or the R team, or teams, okay, these guys need to be iterative, so they typically will use something like Scrum. The development teams, okay, the guys that know how to use the platform that they put together, that everybody else on the product teams is kind of like leery about. These guys don't use Scrum, they actually use a Kanban, and I'll explain how that happens. These guys need a team for communication internally to help one another understand the vagrancies of the architecture and the application of doing things, right? But they need to split out and embed with the various product teams. And I'm starting to call that stuff splitting up into squads. All right, the squads are anywhere from 2 to 4 people that will then work embedded with the product teams. So, whoa, there's a lot of words out there. Oh, so things that we should look at. The research teams that are out there, what are they producing? They're not producing products that we sell, although sometimes platform teams actually will market their thing as an SDK or something for others to use. From a business perspective, that makes no sense at all to me, right? If that's your market differentiator, why are you selling it to others? You're no longer different in the marketplace. Whatever. Our teams aren't producing stuff that we then, you know, ship to people. What they are producing are reference implementations, right? Working software over comprehensive documentation. So they should be producing SDKs, you know, reference implementations. Developers love a good place to cut and paste. Okay, speaking as one. Okay, and the sorts of unit tests that we put together inside of our SDK are the perfect place to start to understand how to actually use the new platform. This is always the next platform, the next incantation of it, if you will, iteration of it. These teams, the development teams that are embedding with the product delivery teams, are using a Kanban state. Ties back to things. If you're doing internal work, you probably have a planning season annually, something like that, where everybody goes back and says, how are we going to spend our money as an organization? Here's the products that are out there. Here's the projects or products that we have to produce. When I work with organizations on the strategic end of the solutioning, you need to come out with a single ranked order backlog of initiatives. Okay. Traditionally, it's done annually. I'd prefer that we revisit that stuff in a rolling fashion, so we do it quarterly. But whatever it is, there's something that's the top on the list. It's some kind of project over here. All right, there's something that's kind of second. It's the next product that's important. Perhaps this means, 10 million to the organization, and this means 5 million to the organization. All right. Embedded inside that initiative are a number of concerns that have platform issues on them. We kind of know them, know a little bit about them. Right? The cone of uncertainty says that the estimates for them are going to be huge because we don't know too much about them. As the product teams are doing their iterative development, they will uncover the actual bits inside of each of these things, which I'll call squad ready. Don't want people to estimate them, but there's something that they're like a 1 or 2 week size, right? But we're not going to estimate them. We just know we have to do them. It's at that point that one of the available squads can pick up stuff in a ready state. All right, so we have a Kanban out here. We only put things into this column when they're squad ready. If there are items that are inside this column, they also have to be ranked in initiative order. So this guy comes out and has something that's squad ready. Well, that's fine. You can put it in there. Here's your next item for the next squad that's available to work with. This guy comes up, though, so that was like a Z. This guy comes up and says, oh, I just figured out one. It came out in our backlog grooming. We have this new squad ready little tasky thing to do. Even though temporarily it exists after this, we order it, keep this in single ranked order based on the value, the ultimate value to the organization. Because when we get to the end of the release, we want to make sure as much as possible that these items on the top are the ones that we worried about the most. And that if we could get work done on these items on the bottom, great. If we couldn't get to them, well, it's not wonderful, but it's understandable. Okay? And then as, of course, they move through, and we have various stages, depending on whatever the team needs to work with. They may have some process internally that they have reviews or whatever. I don't care. They'll work through it. When they're finally done, right, they get accepted when the product team that they're embedded with has a story that they're working on that's accepted. Right? And then they can come back and look for the next ready thing. We then apply metrics along the way to see how we're doing. And we start to understand the cycle times for taking items and putting them into this state. Once we understand the cycle time for an item that's in a squad-ready position, then product owners can plan. And they can say, okay, and this is typically during backlog grooming. You can typically say, okay, we have a bunch of stories that are out here. We just discovered that this story has an item which goes into a Kanban, all right, for the team that's the D teams to work on. We're going to have to get some people in from that platform team and help us. Right? But we know what the cycle time is. And if the cycle time is 2 weeks, then we're not going to take this story and start working on it during this iteration. We're going to hold it for an iteration and find something that didn't have that dependency. But we can see that based on the cycle time and the number of items that are in the ready queue, that our lead time for this is going to be an iteration. So our planning will take place at that last responsible moment. And once we have some history with this stuff, it gets pretty good. So we can break that dependency planning that we otherwise did ad nauseum up front. Okay, so what could possibly go wrong? I'm not going to go through all these things, kind of said most of them. Let me make sure I said the things that I wanted to. The D team should be using the actual steps that they're working with. That's kind of interesting. There will be times when the people on the D team are stumped. It's a complicated platform, complicated thing, and need an R person to come in, no big deal. We have to understand the concept of single streaming and try to swarm around our problems as much as possible. First starting out, so the foreseeability stuff, the embedding. Anyhow, I think I said most of what I wanted to. Of course, the grade on these kinds of things, hey, I made it up, it's going to be good, right? Transportation waste is going to go way down, right? Because we're not spending time breaking down stuff with that upfront planning that we would normally do, you know, when we did traditional or any of the other 5 methods I talked about, right? We've broken that completely away, right? In terms of inventory, we can make sure that what the R team comes out with is kind of like battle hardened and tested. So we're actually simultaneously working with the current set of platform concerns, the way that we attack them. And at the same time, the R team is looking forward, you know, and saying, well, here's the problems that we've been encountering. How can we get better with this? Or they're working with the guys in marketing, you know, forward thinking, I wonder how we can solve some of these chaotic problems that are out there and really build stuff that's exciters and delighters. We brought down the inventory stuff. Motion, of course, is down because we're going back in single streaming. There is a bunch of waiting that's happening. We've gotten better with waiting. The whole reason for doing this is to break the planning dependency between the product and the platform teams. And in my humble opinion, it's worked pretty well. The overprocessing stuff, yeah, you should be careful, you know, that our team could still go out there and gild its architecture, you know, and solve a whole bunch of problems that don't need solving. But we can rein that in with the traditional sort of ways that we do it in Scrum, right? Let's have iterative demos. You know, let's have incremental releases and make sure that the stuff we're doing actually has value. In terms of overproduction, the reason it really gets nailed is that even though Scrum tries to abhor the planning process, planning is mostly a push type of a process. We put all these things out there, do our plan, and then we work upon the plan. The Kanban that we're talking about using is purely pull, right? It's just-in-time delivery of the requirements, if you will, for the platform team to handle. So, you know, in terms of overproduction, there is none because we're not producing until we see the need. So that kind of nails that. Defects get handled a whole heck of a lot better. And the secret behind that is that the people that would be doing the defect remediation on those hard parts, on the stuff that's inside the platform concerns, are working daily, embedded, working with the guys that are doing the product work. So all of that gets a lot better. Batching, yeah, there's no way to eliminate all the waste on the teams, you know, but we've limited the whip, right? I should have said that. A squad that's available can't take on more than one thing at a time. You can only embed with one product team at a time, if that didn't catch that. So batching gets solved. It's kind of the different ways of going about it. Like I say, I've tried all 6, you know, failed at 5, you know, guilty with an explanation. The last one works pretty nicely. So a couple of final thoughts. Okay, scaling, it's a hard thing to do in a larger organization. It works great, small team, you know, kind of stuff, but it's hard to do. We really don't want to just say it's a tough problem and throw up our hands and say, oh, we'll just do waterfall better. It's not going to work, right? Stacy, Sinefeld, the complexity stuff is out there. We have to figure out ways of doing it. Worry a lot about Conway, right? Worry a lot about if you're going to take your platform people and split them all up, right? You know, and again, you're still not planning for the future when you're doing that too. You're not going to fix this sort of stuff in 1 quarter. figuring out the process that will work inside your organization is tough. You want to do it one step at a time. One other note that I should say here is that you want to try, especially at first, not to have more than one platform concern. Okay, if there's two kinds of platforms that you have, figure out a way to do it with just one. Because once you start trying to get those dependencies back at a lower level, planning for the product owner, you're going to have huge issues again. Right? You want to make it simple for them to plan. What else do I have to say? Since we're solving stuff that's complex, you have to go back to values and principles. Okay, the 7 deadly wastes are our friends, in addition to all the stuff that we talk about with Agile. That's kind of like it. So long, thanks for all the fish. And now we move on to the part where we have questions, answers, debate, and then we depart. I tried to leave us a little time. Oh, I wasn't very successful at that, was I? But
I just wanted to clarify your last statement.
Yes.
When the platform guys are working on the squad tasks, are they actually part of the product Scrum at that point?
yes, what we're doing right now is we typically have our scrums in the mornings. Okay, so the platform guys are there. They're working all day on the teams that they're embedding with. Okay, they have what I call a huddle in the afternoon. So kind of like before they go home, they'll come back and talk about events during the day. It's because of the Byzantine and Baroque architecture these guys have settled upon that these guys are like, they're deer with headlights on. They have no idea what to do. So in the afternoon, when they're getting back together, they're talking with one another saying, I have no idea how to go about doing this stuff with a rules engine. Okay, can you help me out with that? And then they'll either spend a little time right afterwards or the next day, and they'll get back together. Again, it's important for them to have a community of support, which they don't have when you just split them up. So that's a good question. Yeah.
And is there some point, an obvious point where they're no longer part of the
right. Yes, they come off of the product teams. There's no estimation, right? So we really don't know in advance how long it's going to take to get something done. We would like it to get done within the iteration. That's the plan, right? So once their item comes up, their work item comes up, and they embed with the right product team, they're there until it's done. And again, we like it within that iteration, but it doesn't have an iteration boundary. And of course, if you're a Scrum person, that story that they were working on, they get a 0 if they didn't get it done in that iteration. And what you find from that is that we want more certainty, right? We want to get it so that we make a commitment and can keep it, which gets us to writing better work items that are more squad ready, so they don't get those 0s. And the variation in velocity doesn't occur, iteration over iteration. It's a great question. Does this make any sense to anybody? Hope so. More questions?
So we have, I don't know if it kind of fits into this, but we have some dedicated DevOps guys.
Uh-huh.
So they're not producing anything that's kind of going to production, but they see what the feature teams are working on. They see where the time is going, where it's being spent, potentially being wasted. And they work on things to make that easier to get rid of those.
Yeah.
And they kind of work with the teams.
Yeah.
That's that kind of thing.
Well, you definitely could, think about them as a platform concern. Okay, and this is kind of putting the cart before the horse. Or do you bring them in? See, what I would do if I was in your kind of shoes, especially since you mentioned that feature team stuff, is bring these guys in as a platform issue. Their concern is around deployment. The other people that are concerned about deployments and know a lot about deployments are QA people, right? Because they're the ones that have to make it work on all the various platforms. I'm talking infrastructure, the hardware platforms, and they can aid one another. So in a DevOps sense, we want to get these guys together and get them before we're getting towards the release, get it done early. So they're doing the continuous integration deployments. They're kind of testing the deployments before they need them, which is going to give you better quality. But so you're actually bringing in people from DevOps and making them, I can see how that could be a platform kind of concern, sure. That would be one where I wouldn't be too worried about the planning aspects. I kind of know it.
Yeah, and it kind of,
Yeah.
and they focus on where time is being spent in the team. So
Yeah.
the team's not working on their feature, they're working on getting their thing built and tested and
Yeah.
pushed on the line.
Yeah. Do they also
So
get,
you can kind of see,
yeah.
in each iteration, you can see, you can be a bit more specific about where you save them time.
Right. You probably can start bringing in some of the people if you have like documentation, training, or stuff that has to go with it. Those are also a DevOps concern?
We have a lot of audit trail that we need to produce.
Oh my God.
for regulators and stuff.
Yeah. But those are other sorts of issues that you probably want to take care of in that same thinking. Yeah. Sounds good? Anybody else? Don't be shy.
Would you consider rolling Kanban out? Why just the DevOps team?
Why just the DevOps team? That's a great concern. That was kind of why I was saying, is it just DevOps that you're talking about? You know, we still have organizations with technical publications people, and I've seen them brought in earlier. I've seen them brought in as part of the Scrum team, but then they kind of sit around most of the time. It's like, we don't have a whole lot to do, right, until there's stuff to document, you know, and they're not going to be able to work as generalized specialists because they're not coders. You know, so bringing them in as a platform concern may be a really interesting idea. I would stick them with the DevOps stuff, but hey, it's not my process.
How about rolling Kanban out to the product teams?
Different talk. The organization I'm with right now, every time I propose something, it was like, okay, let's just go in and let's just go ahead and do it. So it's a transformation effort. You know, and there's probably, how many people? About 150 people on the delivery side of the house. In the past 6 months, we've put together 3 Scrum teams. Okay, so it's still a very small percentage, and we're now bringing in a couple more that we're spinning up. Originally, we did this with like a Scrum for all kind of concept. Okay, but they also failed with guest stars and other aspects of it. And that's when we started to bring in the, recently just with these guys, brought in that last concept to them. Their first reaction to me was like, wow, that sounds great. Why don't we just use Kanban for all the teams? It's a great idea, okay? And I'd like to do that. In fact, remember I started off with, Agile is the new black. A lot of organizations that I work with are really moving away from Scrum, and they're moving into Kanban, altogether. But it's a harder thing for an organization to do because there's less rules. So if you're first starting out, trying to do Kanban for the product teams, even though I think it's probably the right way to do it because of all the other, if it works for the platform people, why wouldn't it work for the product people? But because there's not that many rules, it's hard to do it as your first attempt. Otherwise, I think you're right. I'm kind of past Scrum. I've been doing it too long, or jaded, or... The other thing that bothers me about it is that too many times, because of the marketing for it, organizations just feel, oh, we'll do Scrum and we're all better. And the real thing that they're doing is Scrum or fall. Or some kind of cargo culting. Everybody familiar with the term cargo culting? All right, for those of you that haven't, it's a term that came out, Richard Feynman kind of said it first back in, I think it was 1974 commencement address that he did at Caltech. Feynman was he's a Nobel laureate that got famous with the space shuttle Challenger, and he talked about an O-ring theory about it. Anyhow, in his commencement address, he talked about how during the Second World War, the United States was marching on Japan and doing island hopping. And they would come in, they'd see an island, and they'd establish, the first thing they'd do is like build a big runway, clear it off, and putting a big landing strip for cargo planes, and put up control towers and all this stuff. And when the planes, started to land, natives were very happy. They hadn't seen Westerners before, and all these goods and services started coming in. They got some. It was a happy time. At the end of the war, the Marines came back and they started tearing up all the things that they had built and shipping them home. And natives were like, well, where'd the big birds go? Right? They used to come and fly in, and then we'd have all these goods and services. And somehow the gods, right? These were, these people hadn't seen Westerners. They weren't educated. Somehow the gods, we've angered them. So they went out and started putting up like, bamboo control towers and using coconuts on their heads, and doing all the things that looked like the real thing, but they weren't. And when they did it, nothing happened, right? So Feynman, talked about that in terms of pseudoscience. At a time there was pseudoscience that was going on. Anyhow, cargo culting gets attracted inside of Agile and Scrum because too many times an organization will say, hey, you know what? It's Monday morning, we're Agile now. Okay, I need everybody to get together. Okay, 9 o'clock in the morning, 15 minutes. Okay, what's your status? Good. What's your status? Good. What's your status? Good. This is a cargo cult. We're doing the same kind of stuff, right? But we're not really making change. And then we wonder why we didn't get better as an organization. So, short answer to that. I'll give you a much longer version of that story. Anybody else? I'll be available. It's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you for attending. It lets you access all this junk from whatever device you're on. Those devices, of course, being their products, right? And it's built into every iOS device. Okay, to be fair, here's one from Microsoft talking about Windows 8. Okay, same kind of thing. It's focused on delivering one experience across all the devices in your life. These are the platforms, right, that are getting used in all the products that they produce. Now, not every platform is readily apparent. When I was thinking about this and reaching back, I was working with a, well, it's AT&T, right, major US telecom. And they wanted some stuff on a whole bunch of mobile apps that they would stick onto their phones. Since they were controlling a large part of the stack, the physical stack, let's see, am I giving away too much on this? Yeah, I guess so. They had some unique stuff that they were embedding deep inside of TCP/IP that allowed them to, there's NDAs in here.
We'll let you suicide at the end of the talk.
Yeah, I'm going to get, please don't sue me, anybody. There are some unique features that they were embedding deep inside TCP/IP that allowed them to allow you to see content and know stuff about the content on different sorts of platforms, on different sort of products that were out there. And this stack was something that would be used on all the different sorts of projects, for all the different sorts of products that they had. So it was a huge problem. How do we work this in a traditional Scrum type setting? Right? In a Scrum setting, we want a team of people, all the people that are necessary to write the software. Right? We want generalized specialists and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, these guys that were doing the low-level TCP/IP stuff had no desire, clue, skills, in working, with a presentation layer for a particular Android platform, right? And there weren't enough of them to go around, right? We had a lot of teams out there developing these mobile apps. So how exactly do we do that? So it's a true pain in the process to try to transform an organization like that, okay? And you run into lots of issues when you start thinking about the why. Why do we do Scrum? Right? We do it because of, well, why do we do Scrum? I'll open the question to you. Why should I say it? Raise your, I think there's an article in there about something being the new black, but when I look at it, I don't see it anymore. So it's a picture of Lady Gaga, whatever, new black. There's a nagging problem that goes on, okay, when we're talking about Agile and Scrum. And that problem has to do with scaling. And it's something that's been there since the beginning. That, a lot of Agilists, in particular, those that are really Scrum-oriented, just kind of like wave their hands and say, no, it's no problem at all, right? So you've probably heard, if you've been doing Scrum for a while, that to scale Scrum, it's simple. You just call a scrum of scrums, and like everything is better, and you ask 3 magic questions to your scrum team, ask 3 magic questions in your scrum of scrums, and all your problems are better. Is that, who uses scrum of scrums around here? Are they happy? They don't. Yeah, and you know, and that's the thing about it is, I believe it was actually a question of Sutherland. They asked him way back when, okay, how do you scale? And he was like standing in a place like this, and he said, well, that's easy. You just make a scrum of scrums. And people kind of did that. But it doesn't work. You know, I've been trying that for quite a while. I think that there's an issue, you know, where in a very small setting, which is organic, you know, where the teams want to do it. If you have good people, they're going to figure it out on the team. And if you have, you know, 2 or 3 teams, they can figure it out between them. But there's a huge issue involved, and it has to do with kind of the tribal communication. I mean, how many people you have, you know, what is it, Dunbar's number, right? I mean, past 150 people, you can't form groups, and you have smaller clans, you know, at around 80, and then a smaller tribe that's around 15 or so, and you know, you get these family units at, you know, 5 or 7, which explains why we have teams at that size, right? And it's a nasty problem. It's hard to get around it. You know, how do we scale Agile in a larger setting? So I want to give you a little scope, okay, what we're going to talk about. I'm not particularly worried for this talk about how we take a particular project and just add more Scrum teams to it. I think that's a fairly well understood problem and, you know, fairly decent solutions for it. I used to work with Craig Larman, so those of you that are looking for scaling books, you know, Craig has written a couple of them. And I believe in you know, that kind of setting. It basically kind of looks like this. Right, I might as well start drawing some pictures here. Right, your typical sort of a Scrum environment, you know, is a sprint planning, right, which goes on to, you know, daily planning, you know, which we call the daily Scrum, right, and this stuff, you know, iterates, right, and then it ends in a demo and a retrospective, you know, and then the cycle kind of, you know, continues. Right, everybody's working from that big old backlog out here, and then they're coming up with another backlog for the sprint, you know, with smaller stories in it, less of them. Right, everybody's familiar with that one. Right, what Craig will say, what I'll say also, is that if you're trying to scale this so you need more teams, you know, the stuff that works, again, small settings, you know, respecting that communication stuff, is it's possible to have the teams working in parallel. This is where architecture and planning comes in handy. I wish I did some of that. And then before you go into that, you have to have some joint planning. Right, so it'll start off in a scaled environment where we're having several Scrum teams that are trying to work on the same project. There's a common product backlog. Craig will call these, instead of sprint teams, he'll call them feature teams. But we're going to partition the work that's out here into something that makes sense for each of the sprint teams to work with. Right, the sprint teams will actually then do detailed planning, right, and then they'll go through, you know, at the end of the cycle. Wow, I really screwed up bad. Instead of a demo for each group, all of these will come together into a demo for the group of groups, right? They'll split up. Each team will do their retrospective. Okay, how do we get better as a team, okay, in our sprints to go? And then there'll be a retrospective for the team of teams. How do we work better as an organization? Are people familiar with that model at all? Yeah, that's common, and it works, okay? Again, up to limits, doesn't scale very far, but for a typical sort of project, We're not going to talk about that today. We have a single product and its features. You can get. My name's Howard Deiner. You probably know that already. And we'll be talking about an agility problem where we're talking about using agility in a scaled solution, in a larger setting, something not just one small team on a greenfield project, and how do we do this? So it's a more complicated problem. I'm going to speak specifically about the issues that I'll call platform versus product concerns, how we can distinguish them, how we understand them, and what we can do with them. And we'll see how that fits in with your situations. I do want to leave some time. I think this would be an excellent kind of lecture to leave time at the end to try to speak to people and their situations. I think that there might be lots to share within the crowd, so I'm going to try to do that. But don't hesitate to stop me while we're going and say, Howard, that doesn't make any sense, or whatever. If it's something I can deal with, we'll talk about it then and there. If not, I'll defer it. But please try to keep it interactive as much as possible. All right, so to get going. Oh, that's inauspicious. Start again. Hi. Better. Focus problem. Anyhow, here's the lecture. But we'll start drilling down into stuff. I typically like to talk about the problems that we're looking at rather than the solutions at first, to give us some context and center us. And I'm going to start off with the comment that Agile isn't particularly new. Okay, I mean, I was amazed, when I started coming here, I think in 2011, at Software Architect Conference, and agility was something that was there, but it wasn't like big mainstream thing. And especially at the session yesterday, when I asked people, well, how many people are doing Scrum? Which I'll ask again, how many people are doing Scrum in their organization? See, and back in 2011, I might have gotten like a quarter of that. Okay, and in a sense, Agile's become the new black. Right? I mean, if you're not doing Agile in your organization, people look at you like, well, why? Why wouldn't you want to do that? It's got such great things, and you get such beautiful outcomes. Why wouldn't you want to do it? But there are some problems with it. And I'll tell you the honest truth, and people that know me, know that I put these enigmatic, placeholders, photos, and stuff in here. I can't really figure out why I used that cover from Vanity Fair. Get by with that. What I do want to talk about are organizations that have multiple products, multiple things. I'll tell you exactly, more specifics of what I mean by that. Where there are some core competencies, okay, that are built in to each of these products that are distributed through the products themselves, right? So we have some core stuff the company does. Let's just say it's data analytics, right? And then I have a bunch of products on top of that. Some of them are portals. Other things are, we'll distribute this information on portable devices, without using some kind of portal. Other things, work with some embedded devices. Okay, but they all work from that common competency of the company. The real value is in the data analytics in this case. Okay, so let me talk about what the differences will be when I say platforms versus products. Okay, and the first thing to recognize is what products look like. Products are in product lines. And I'm picking here on Apple. I guess this is the last generation of their hardware, right? They have a basic thing that they sell, right? The basic thing that they're selling allows them, is visible in various forms on different products that they have, right? So you take, a small product, it kind of fits in your hand. There's some specific things that it does better than others, right? I mean, those of you who use like, an iPhone, for me, I'll put my music on it, but I won't put it on an iPad, right? iPad's meant to be held with two hands, right? And stuff that I'll do on there, I won't do things on that I'll do on my laptop, even though I could do them across all the lines. There's commonalities within them, especially when you look at the hardware. There are commonalities inside of it, but they're distinct product lines, distinct market segments that they sell them into. They're different customers in mind. Right? We might not sell a consumer product to a business. Right? Product lines. There are platforms inside of this. Now, in the Apple case, those platforms are pretty apparent. Okay, and the one I'm going to pick on here is iCloud. Right? There's an iCloud platform embedded in all that stuff. Okay, each one of the products will use this platform. Right? And if you look at what Apple will say about it, they'll try to describe it. They'll try to give it some boundary, some functionality, some scope. Okay, it's more than storing your content.